My name is Elena Moore, and for most of my childhood, I believed love was something you earned by being quiet, useful, and invisible. I didn't come to that understanding through one terrible moment or a single cruel sentence. It came slowly, settling into me the way dust settles on unused furniture, silently, persistently, until it became part of the room. I was 7 years old when I first noticed that my parents' eyes didn't rest on me the way they used to. Conversations paused when I entered. Laughter softened. Not stopped, just redirected, like a radio station changing frequency. I learned quickly that something about me disrupted the atmosphere of our home. I just didn't know what I'd done wrong. My parents had me young. That detail followed me everywhere, even when it wasn't spoken out loud. I grew up hearing fragments of their lives before me, how my mother had planned to travel, how my father wanted to move cities, how everything had to be postponed because of responsibility. They never said my name in those sentences, but I felt it sitting there anyway, heavy and unmovable. As a child, I didn't understand resentment. I only understood tone. My mother's voice tightened when she spoke to me, like she was bracing herself. My father addressed me with instructions, not warmth. Don't touch that. Go do your homework. Not now. Everything about our interactions felt transactional. I existed to behave correctly, to not cause problems, to stay out of the way. Affection was rare and unpredictable. My mother didn't hug me unless someone was watching. My father praised me only when my achievements could be shared. At home, silence was safer than honesty. I learned how to read footsteps in the hallway, how to interpret the slam of a cabinet, how to tell when it was better to retreat to my room and become very small. I believed, truly believed, that if I needed less, they would like me more. School became my escape, but also my battlefield. I wanted teachers to notice me. I wanted someone to ask if I was okay and mean it. When they didn't, I talked too much. I questioned rules. I pushed boundaries. It wasn't rebellion, it was desperation. If I couldn't be loved, maybe I could at least be acknowledged. My parents didn't see it that way. Every note sent home felt like a personal failure to them, not because they were worried about me, but because it reflected poorly on them. Their disappointment wasn't quiet. It came in long lectures, in comparisons to other children, in warnings about how hard I was making their lives. They never asked why I was struggling. They only asked why I couldn't be easier. Then, just before my 8th birthday, something shifted. The house felt different, lighter. My mother started humming while she cleaned. My father stayed up late talking with her in low, excited voices. They smiled more, but not at me. It was like a secret was blooming between them, and I wasn't invited to know what it was. I watched carefully, trying to figure out what had changed. I thought maybe I'd finally done something right. Maybe they were proud of me. Maybe things were about to get better. They weren't. My birthday party was small. Family, a cake, a few balloons taped to the wall. I remember standing in the living room, sticky fingers from frosting, when my parents asked everyone for their attention. My father cleared his throat. My mother beamed. They announced the pregnancy like it was an accomplishment. The room erupted. Applause. Tears. Hugs. Congratulations poured in from every direction. My mother looked radiant in a way I had never seen. My father's smile was wide and unguarded. I clapped because everyone else was clapping. I smiled because that was what was expected of me. But something inside me went very still. I watched them closely, really watched them, and realized this joy wasn't new. It had been growing quietly, just out of my reach. This was what they had been waiting for. Not just another child, a second chance, a better timed one. That night, after the guests left, they sat me down at the kitchen table. Their voices were calm, almost gentle. They told me I would be staying with my aunt for a while. They said I needed more structure, that a change would be good for me. I begged. I promised. I told them I could do better. Be quieter. Try harder. Be easier. They didn't change their minds. As I lay in bed that night, listening to them talk excitedly about names and colors and plans, I understood something that would shape the rest of my life. They had chosen, and it wasn't me. After that night at the kitchen table, everything in our house began to revolve around something I couldn't see yet. The pregnancy became the center of gravity, pulling all attention toward it and away from me. My mother taped ultrasound photos to the refrigerator. My father downloaded apps that tracked fetal development week by week. Conversations no longer included me unless I was being instructed to help or stay out of the way. I tried harder. I cleaned without being asked. I finished my homework early. I stayed quiet during meals. Every small success felt like a test I was taking alone. I watched my parents' faces carefully, searching for approval, but their expressions barely shifted. It was as if their emotional capacity had already been filled. My room started to change too. Boxes appeared. Old toys were sorted into piles. "We'll donate some of this," my mother said casually, as if she were talking about expired groceries. I stood in the doorway and nodded, pretending it didn't hurt to see my childhood being boxed up before I'd even grown out of it. One evening, I overheard my parents talking in the living room. They didn't know I was listening. My father's voice was tired, irritated. "She's not adjusting," he said. "She needs more attention than we can give right now." My mother sighed. "The baby needs calm. Stability. We can't have chaos." Chaos. That was me. I realized then that their decision hadn't been made at the kitchen table. That conversation had only been the announcement. They had been preparing for my exit long before they told me. The pregnancy moved forward, and with it, the invisible line between me and the family I thought I belonged to grew thicker. Doctor appointments replaced school events. Nursery planning replaced bedtime stories. When relatives visited, they spoke to my mother's stomach, not to me. "Are you excited to be a big sister?" they asked. I nodded because that was easier than explaining that excitement wasn't what I felt. Fear was. A few weeks before the baby was due, my aunt started coming over more often. She watched me closely, asked me questions my parents never did. "How are you feeling about all this?" she asked once, when my parents were in the other room. I shrugged. "Fine." She didn't push. She just squeezed my shoulder gently, like she knew "fine" was a language children used when they didn't feel safe telling the truth. The day I officially left came without ceremony. No goodbye dinner. No family meeting. Just a suitcase placed by the door and my aunt's car waiting in the driveway. My mother handed me a list of rules: bedtime, chores, expectations. My father reminded me to behave, to not make things difficult. They spoke like this was temporary, like I was going to camp. But none of them looked sad. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the house. The curtains were new. Pale yellow. Nursery colors. My home had already started changing into something I no longer fit inside. The drive to my aunt's house felt endless. I pressed my forehead to the window and watched my neighborhood disappear, each turn of the road pulling me further from the life I knew. I didn't cry. Crying felt pointless. Tears were something you shed when someone might notice. My aunt's house was quieter, smaller. But when she opened the door, she hugged me without hesitation. Not a quick, polite hug, a real one. Firm. Protective. It caught me off guard. "You're safe here," she whispered. I didn't know how to respond to that. Safety wasn't a concept I was familiar with. The first few weeks were strange. I didn't unpack right away. I kept my clothes folded in the suitcase, ready to leave. I expected my parents to call, to check in, to say they missed me. They didn't. When the baby was born, I found out through a text message. A photo followed, a tiny face wrapped in blankets. My parents' joy poured through the screen. Everyone in the family congratulated them. No one asked how I felt. My aunt noticed. She didn't say anything at first, but that night she sat beside me on the couch and asked, "Do you want to talk about it?" I shook my head. The words were there, trapped behind something heavy. She didn't push. She just stayed. Life slowly shifted into a new rhythm. My aunt helped me with homework. She attended school meetings. She defended me when teachers complained instead of assuming I was the problem. For the first time, I felt like someone was on my side. My grades improved. My behavior settled. Not because I was trying harder, but because I wasn't trying to survive anymore. Months passed. Then years. My parents called occasionally. Short conversations. Polite questions. They talked about the baby constantly. About milestones. About how happy they were. They never asked if I wanted to visit. I learned then that being chosen wasn't about love. It was about convenience. About timing. About who fit best into the life they wanted. And I wasn't that child. By the time I turned 9, the word temporary had lost its meaning. At first, I counted days. then weeks. I imagined my parents calling, saying they were ready for me to come home, that the baby was settled, that things had calmed down. Every night, I lie my shoes neatly by the bed in case I needed to leave quickly. But the call never came. Instead, my parents' voices faded into something distant and formal. When they spoke to me, it felt like talking to a relative you barely know, polite, careful, emotionally shallow. They asked about school in vague terms. They talked about the baby in detail. They always sounded busy. I stopped expecting more. My aunt never used the word temporary. She never promised I would go back. She also never said I wouldn't. She let me exist without forcing a future I wasn't ready to face. That alone felt like kindness. Her house ran on consistency, something I had never known. Dinner happened at the same time every night. Questions were asked and actually answered. When I made mistakes, we talked about them. No lectures. No shame. I didn't know how to trust that at first. I waited for her patience to run out. I expected the sighs, the sharp tones, the exhaustion that always came before rejection in my parents' house. But they never came. Even when I tested boundaries, forgot homework, snapped back, withdrew, she stayed steady. Slowly, I stopped performing. I joined the school art club. I stayed late working on projects I actually enjoyed. Teachers described me as thoughtful instead of difficult. The shift was so gradual I barely noticed it happening, but one day I realized something startling. I wasn't afraid all the time anymore. My parents visited once, about a year after the baby was born. They arrived with gifts and cameras. My mother commented on how much taller I'd gotten. My father joked about how independent I was now. Independent, like it had been my choice. They stayed for an hour. Most of that time was spent talking about my sister, her sleep schedule, her appetite, how much she looked like my mother. They left without asking if I wanted to come home. That was the day I finally understood. I wasn't on pause. I wasn't being stored until they had space for me again. I had been replaced. The realization didn't come with tears or anger. It came with clarity, and clarity hurt in a quieter, deeper way. After that, I stopped calling them first. I let the silence stretch. They didn't seem to notice. Life with my aunt continued to grow into something stable. She attended parent-teacher conferences. She learned which foods I hated and which songs calmed me down when I couldn't sleep. She showed up, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. I learned what love looked like when it wasn't conditional. Holidays were still complicated. We visited extended family, and my parents were there with my sister, who toddled around with curls and bright clothes. Everyone doted on her. I stood to the side, smiling politely, unsure of my place. My parents introduced me as their daughter, but it sounded rehearsed. Like a fact they remembered, not a relationship they lived. My sister didn't know me. Not really. To her, I was a stranger who shared a last name. That realization stung more than I expected. As I grew older, the gap widened. My sister's life was full of opportunities, dance classes, private lessons, vacations. My parents shared photos online, proud captions attached. They curated happiness carefully. I watched from a distance. I didn't resent my sister. I resented the lie that my parents had told themselves, that choosing one child didn't mean losing the other. By the time I reached high school, my parents' calls had dwindled to obligatory check-ins. Birthdays were acknowledged with cards. Sometimes money was sent, always accompanied by reminders to be grateful. Grateful for what? For being discarded, gently instead of harshly? My aunt never spoke badly about them. She didn't need to. Their absence spoke loudly enough. She encouraged me to apply for scholarships. She supported my dreams without making them about herself. When I got accepted into college, she cried. Not because it reflected well on her, but because she was proud of me. My parents sent a congratulatory text. That was when I knew for certain whatever bond we had once shared was gone. And yet, some part of me still believed the story wasn't finished. I didn't know then that 12 years after they had chosen one child over the other, they would reach out, not with remorse, but with need. And that when they did, everything they thought they had buried would come back to the surface. High school ended, and I walked across the stage feeling lighter than I had ever felt in my life. Graduation wasn't just an academic milestone, it was a declaration. I had survived. I had built a life without waiting for approval from the people who had once made me feel invisible. My aunt hugged me fiercely afterward, and I realized something simple but profound. She had never needed me to perform. She had never judged my worth by my obedience or my silence. Her love had been steady and real, and it had given me the foundation to grow. College was the first time I truly tasted freedom. I chose my courses. I joined clubs because I wanted to, not because it reflected well on my family. I made friends who laughed at my jokes, stayed up late talking about dreams, and never left me feeling like I had to shrink to fit into their lives. For the first time, I experienced normalcy, an ordinary kind of love that felt miraculous. Through it all, my parents existed on the periphery, a faint hum of obligation rather than connection. Their calls came during holidays, awkward and scripted. They asked about my grades, about scholarships, about the programs I was enrolled in, but never about how I felt, never about what I wanted. The conversation always pivoted to my sister, who had grown into the image of perfection they had longed for. Each story about her successes reminded me how carefully they had curated the one child they truly wanted. I learned not to flinch anymore. The absence, the favoritism, the silent rejection, it all became background noise. I focused on my life, on the people who actually saw me, on the small victories that weren't measured by parental approval. It was exhausting at first to build my identity in the absence of my biological parents' love, but it was also exhilarating. I was reclaiming space that had been denied to me. By the time I had graduated from college, I had built a life of my own making. A career I loved, friends who felt like chosen family, opportunities one had earned with my own hands. And yet, in quiet moments late at night, a tiny part of me still wondered, would they ever call? Would they ever acknowledge that they had chosen wrongly? That I had existed, thrived, and built something they had ignored for so long? Then, one ordinary Thursday evening, my phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something about it made my heart skip a beat. I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to keep the life I had built safe from their intrusion. But another part, the part that had spent 12 years replaying memories of neglect and longing, picked up the phone. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Elena, it's your mother." A voice chirped, artificially warm, too practiced. "We've been thinking about you. We'd like to reconnect, to talk about family, about everything." I froze, listening. Their words sounded genuine, almost apologetic, but my gut told me otherwise. There was a carefulness, a rhythm, a performance in their tone. I recognized it immediately, the voice of people used to hiding truth, used to orchestrating perception. They asked about my studies, my apartment, my friends. Then, inevitably, the conversation shifted. They talked about my sister, how she was struggling, how she had made choices that reflected poorly on them, how they feared what the neighbors, the relatives, the teachers would think. The subtle implication was clear. My worth, my attention, my validation, was needed to prove they had done well. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because their carefully constructed image was cracking. I listened quietly, letting them speak. Their carefully measured sentences painted a picture of responsible parents worried about their other child. But the subtext was unmistakable. I had been absent from their lives, not out of accident or circumstance, but convenience. And now that their chosen child's imperfections threatened their narrative, they needed me to restore balance. A strange calm washed over me. I realized that 12 years of distance had given me a lens I never had as a child. I could see their manipulation clearly. I could see the pattern: neglect one child, overindulge the other, control the narrative, protect their image. And now, just like before, I was being called in, not for love, but for utility. I didn't respond immediately. I let the words hang, let the pauses stretch long enough for the truth to sink in. This wasn't about reconnection. It was about validation. It was about appearances. For the first time, I understood fully their sense of family wasn't about who they loved, it was about who made them look good. And all along, that choice had never included me. The conversation with my mother stretched for nearly an hour. Every sentence was carefully constructed, rehearsed, polished. She spoke about my sister's struggles in school, her misbehavior, how worried they were about the family's reputation. They described her mistakes with a precision that left no room for emotion, only the implication that I could, and should, fix it by simply existing in their narrative. I realized something slowly, painfully. They weren't reaching out because they regretted how they treated me. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because their carefully chosen child, the one they had favored, the one they had built their version of happiness around, was starting to falter. And they needed evidence that they hadn't failed as parents. Evidence. That's what I was to them now. Not a daughter. Not a person. Proof. I let them talk. I didn't interrupt, even as their words pricked at old wounds. I didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't plead. Instead, I listened, as I had learned to do when I was 8, when silence had been my shield. I recognized the patterns immediately: neglect me, overindulge the other, manipulate, control, and protect the image at all costs. 12 years ago, I had been removed quietly. Today, they wanted to rewrite history in my favor. Finally, I spoke. Calmly. You didn't raise me, I said. You removed me. You chose her over me. I survived because someone else loved me when you wouldn't. Silence filled the line. For the first time, I had shifted the dynamic. Their carefully practiced voices faltered. My father's sharp, defensive tone appeared first. That's not fair, he said. We did the best we could. You're being dramatic. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for acknowledgement. I stated facts. I was sent away. My aunt raised me, supported me, loved me. You were absent. I succeeded despite you, not because of you. My mother stammered. She attempted guilt, implying that I was ungrateful, that I was turning my back on the family. Their voices rose, trying to regain control, but the rhythm had changed. This was no longer their conversation to dominate. I had spoken the truth, and it had weight. They tried a different tactic. My aunt had sent me letters, emails, and copies of every document from my childhood, the receipts for school supplies, reports from teachers, records of my achievements, proof of their neglect. I cited these calmly, without accusation, simply presenting evidence. Their carefully constructed narrative couldn't withstand facts. You're poisoning everyone against us, my father finally shouted. But I didn't respond with anger. I didn't have to. I knew the truth would do more damage than words. It always had. I paused, letting the silence grow heavy. And then I said something I had never said before. Family isn't who claims you. Family is who shows up, who loves you, and who helps you grow. You chose her, not me. And now, your lies and your need for control are being exposed. This is the consequence. The line went quiet. Not a polite pause, not hesitation. True silence. I knew in that moment that everything had shifted. The power was no longer theirs. They had chosen one child, and 12 years later, that choice had led to the unraveling of a narrative they had tried to control. I hung up, not in anger, not in victory, but with relief. For the first time in my life, I felt a sense of closure. 12 years of anticipation, of fear, of longing, had culminated in a moment where truth reigned over manipulation. I didn't call back. I didn't apologize. I didn't make excuses. I simply existed as I had always been, independent, strong, and loved by someone who truly cared. The consequences rippled quickly. Relatives who had once accepted my parents' narrative began asking questions. Whispers about favoritism and neglect surfaced. My parents tried to maintain control, but the cracks were visible to everyone who cared to look. The image they had curated so carefully for years was no longer airtight. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. Instead, I focused on my life, my career, my friends, my chosen family. And for the first time, I realized that the most powerful consequence wasn't shame, wasn't guilt, it was truth. Their favoritism, their neglect, and their obsession with appearances had created a daughter who was resilient, self-sufficient, and capable of recognizing the difference between real love and performative love. Even now, when I think of my sister, I feel compassion rather than resentment. She is still growing up in a household that confuses control with care and material abundance with emotional presence. But I no longer need to carry the weight of their choices or fix the damage they caused. That responsibility doesn't belong to me. The lesson was clear. Love cannot be commanded, earned, or bought. It can only be freely given. And if it isn't given, life offers other hands to hold you, other hearts to teach you how to breathe again. Months passed after the confrontation, and the silence from my parents was almost deafening. No calls, no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation. For once, their absence wasn't a wound, it was a shield. A shield I no longer needed to test, guard, or negotiate around. I had survived their neglect, and now their disappearance felt like justice rather than loss. Word spread quietly among relatives. People who had once smiled politely at their performance of perfection began to notice the cracks. The birthday party photos, the carefully curated achievements, the claims of a perfect child, they no longer held weight. Some relatives reached out to me privately, apologizing for believing the stories, asking if I was okay. Others simply acknowledged my success without comment, letting the truth speak for itself. My parents, predictably, tried to spin it. My father called one evening, anger sharp in his voice. My mother followed with tears and self-pity, claiming I had ruined everything, that I was turning the family against them. But I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I simply recited facts calmly, referring to school records, letters, and receipts my aunt had kept for over a decade. Their narrative collapsed quietly under its own weight. I realized something powerful in that period. Consequences aren't always loud. Sometimes, consequences are quiet. They are the truth that can't be denied, the exposure that can't be undone, the recognition that the choices you make echo far beyond the moment you thought mattered most. They had chosen one child, and 12 years later, that choice had defined them as much as it had defined me. Meanwhile, my life continued to grow in richness and stability. I graduated with honors, secured a career I loved, and surrounded myself with people who actually saw me. My aunt remained my anchor, the person who had believed in me when my own parents didn't. Holidays, birthdays, achievements, they were shared with people who mattered, who showed up, and who didn't demand my worth in exchange for love. And then, one evening, a message appeared on my phone from an unfamiliar number. It was my sister. Her tone was hesitant, shy, almost fearful. She didn't know how to reach out, didn't know if she should trust me, didn't know what had happened behind the scenes for all these years. We spoke slowly at first, carefully. She asked questions about our past, about what she had been told, about my experiences. I didn't offer judgment, didn't lecture, didn't point fingers. I simply answered honestly. Slowly, she began to understand, piece by piece, that the home she grew up in was not as perfect as she had been led to believe. It was fragile, awkward, sometimes painful, but it was real. And that reality mattered far more than a story curated for appearances. For the first time, I understood that family wasn't defined by shared DNA alone. It was defined by truth, presence, and unconditional care. My parents faded further into the background after that. Relatives stopped taking their version of events seriously. My father's influence dwindled, my mother's carefully rehearsed image fell apart, and the narrative they had controlled for years could no longer hide the truth. They faced the natural consequences of their choices, not in dramatic public humiliation, but in the subtle recognition that they had lost control over the story of their children. I no longer felt bitterness. I didn't hate them. I understood the limits of their love, the priorities they had set, and the emptiness of what they had chosen over compassion and care. I forgave myself for expecting what they couldn't give. I cherished the people who had truly loved me, and I finally allowed myself to feel that quiet, unshakable pride, that I had survived, that I had thrived, and that I had created a life of meaning, truth, and connection. Sometimes, when I think about my sister, I feel deep compassion. She still navigates the household I left behind, the same cycles of conditional love and performative care. But now, there is hope for her too. Hope that she will one day see the patterns, recognize the manipulation, and reclaim her own life with the same clarity I did. And as for me, I carry no resentment. I carry understanding. Family isn't about who claims you or who chooses you first. It's about who shows up, who holds you, and who believes in you without calculation. Everything I am today, the strength, the independence, the love I've learned to give and receive, is built on that foundation. The past shaped me, but it no longer defines me. In the end, 12 years later, my parents faced their consequences not through anger or punishment, but through exposure, truth, and the unyielding reality of the life I had built without them. And I, finally, could step into my own story fully, unburdened and unafraid, knowing that love in its purest form cannot be chosen. It is earned through presence, honesty, and care.